When you will be the second person to join the meeting.
Second portion of our session, succession strategies for the new work environment. As you might have heard me say at the end of the first recording, this is going to be a much shorter recording, if you will. Leah and I were very ambitious. We knew that there would be a lot of great group discussion, which there was. So we had very little time to talk about some of the case profiles that you see here. I just wanted to give you a taste, a high-level overview of some of the cases that we've seen from other companies on how they're making the shift to a more portfolio management-focused approach when it comes to succession management. What we're going to do in the rest of the time that we have together, which is about roughly 10 minutes to 15 minutes, we're going to talk about the first two columns that you see here. The first column is all about making sure you take a demand-driven planning approach. So how do you start with a business need in mind when it comes to succession planning, other than, what are the leadership roles that exist now and what's the leadership talent that exists out there? So in this particular section, we're going to talk about an interesting practice from a small company called MTS India and how they try to predict future leadership roles and incorporate it into their succession planning efforts. If you take a look at the second column, sourcing strategy, here we're going to talk about how you can begin to think about taking a broad sourcing approach, right? So I said earlier is that, identifying people early in their career is not a guarantee that you'll be able to hold on to them. They will still leave the organization or not be considered high potential or successor for various reasons. So you start with a bigger pool. The way that you get to a bigger pool is you take a broad sourcing approach, if you will. You identify non-obvious successors, maybe, for specific positions and outside the business unit for that particular position. So with that quick introduction, let's get into the details of these columns. So turn with me to the next page. This page here, I'm going to adjust the screen a little bit. But what you'll find here is that there are ways that you can typically plan for future leadership needs, right? The first is the supply-driven, and that's what you see here on the left of the page. So what we mean by that is we're trying to predict, who's going to actually leave their leadership roles in the future, and who's the best talent that would be good to assume those leadership roles. That's one way to do it, and that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is really what you see here. Let's actually try to forecast what future leadership needs might be, starting with the business in mind. So take a look at some of the questions that you would want to ask yourself to take a demand-driven planning approach. How organization strategy change in the next 3 to 5 years? What implications would change have on our strategy, on our current roles, right? What changing strategy create, strategy create new leadership positions in the future? Or how integrated is our succession process with changing business priorities? Take a look at the bottom of the page. This shouldn't be a big surprise to you. We actually asked HR leaders whether they do any of the things that you see here. And as you can see from the dark shading, there are a lot more organizations that try to predict vacancies in current roles. There are organizations who try to forecast future leadership needs. So that's the current state that we live in. I'm going to skip the next page because I think this will be very familiar to you. This is part of the business case on why we want to take demand-driven planning approach. It's going to be better for your bench strength at the end of the day. So you're more able to ensure continuity, but also optionality, which you might remember from the first session. Let's take a look at a couple of case profiles that we had an opportunity to focus on. So on the left, we have a general mill practice. And it's a really interesting practice because it's about, doing your talent review meeting very differently. Instead of it being focused on, what leadership talent looked like from a very kind of task orientation perspective, what General Mills decided to do was let's actually not talk about leadership performance in talent meetings. Let's actually take a look at what we need to accomplish from a leadership perspective in the future. Kind of shifting the conversation, if you will, through a regular vehicle, which are talent review meetings. We're going to spend a little bit of time on is what you see toward the right of the page. It's on MTS India, which is a smaller company, but I think that the practice that they're doing, has maybe relevance to a broad range of companies. You would exactly do it might be a little bit different, but I think what they're doing is quite interesting. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about their specific approach. Just a bit of background on MTS India, if that's okay with you. As I said, they're on the smaller side. They have about 2,000 employees. They're obviously in India. They're a telecommunications they're in telecommunications industry. This practice that I'm going to talk about in just a moment is a 4-year-old practice, and they've had an opportunity to iterate it a couple of times. I think they're in the midst of their second iteration on how to improve the process that I'm about to describe. But before I talk about what they're doing now that's interesting, let me actually talk to you about what they did in the past. Because they operate in the telecommunications industry, which is ever-changing, continuously dynamic, they knew that to be successful as a company, had to have the right leaders, obviously. But in order to have the right leaders, they had to have a future orientation. So one of the things that they did was they decided to take a look at their competency model, see if they can make it more future-focused. Instead of trying to understand, hey, what are competencies that exist, or what are the competencies that leaders need to demonstrate now? What do we think the competencies that will be important in the future, and put it as part of our competency model? However, as interesting as of a concept as that, they found that it was still too vague in terms of what they could do with it from a succession planning perspective. Sure, if you take a look at some of the competencies on the upper right, you could incorporate that when you try to identify successors or when you try to develop it, but it's lacked teeth, it's lacked rigidity, which is essential, or some form of structure, which is a little bit essential when you do succession planning. So here's what they actually did. Take a look at the bottom of the page and adjust the screen. The very first thing that they did is HR, or specifically their head of OD, plus a couple of other OD members, decided to create job descriptions for future leadership roles. And the way they went about that is they had iterative conversations with their strategy team. And the strategy team basically answered questions about, what's the future of the telecoms industry, where are we growing as a company, where are we going to place our big bets, other things that, that's important to know about the direction that the company was headed. They actually took that information and decided, hey, based on this information, we think that there are going to be a handful of roles that will increase in importance in the future. What they did was they drafted sample job descriptions, which they then, if you take a look at the bottom right of the page, asked the business to buy into and to validate. These have been validated in terms of the job descriptions. They were integrated as part of the succession management process. So to put it very simply, what MTS India decided to do was to, anticipate, forecast what future leadership roles might be. And they decided to do it in a very business-driven perspective. They had conversations with a strategy team to understand the direction of the company, the direction of the industry. They took the information and ascertained that there are certain roles that are going to be important in the future. And they built out robust job descriptions for those specific positions which don't exist now. We then asked the business to validate. And once the business validated it, they actually included it as part of their succession management efforts. I'm showing a very short excerpt, or an excerpt of the case profile. So if you want the details, I sent a follow-up email to Leah with links to all of the case profiles here. Now a little bit more color, and I'm going to make it a little bit smaller on how they actually went about creating job descriptions. The very first step was HR had a conversation with a strategy team to talk about future industry trends, opportunities for growth, and other critical areas for business focus. And I think the important thing here is they really took that future orientation seriously. It was not about what's going to happen in the next 6 months or the next 8 months, but what do we think will happen in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years? And again, a lot of prediction, but hopefully intelligently driven prediction coming from the strategy team here. But they wanted to make sure that they didn't, focus on replacement planning, but really focus on succession planning at the end of the day. So that's the very first step. Second step is the OD team then came together and basically came up with criteria or questions to ask themselves to make sure that they identified a really, strong list of potential critical roles. And so some of the criteria that they use are what you see on this page. So trying to figure out if they should create a new leadership role or not, they took a look at whether that leadership role in consideration had strategy impact, whether it had revenue impact, and whether that specific position, if it rose in importance in the future or had to be created in the future, if you actually hire for that position externally. And some of the other kind of questions that they ask themselves to validate their efforts. But at the end of the day, what the HR team wants to end up with is a list of potential future critical roles. Now, the profile ends in terms of my presentation. You can actually take a look at the job description template that they developed for every critical role that they think will increase in importance in the future. Some of the things that you should be aware of in terms of what they've learned from the process. What they learned from the process was that it's just as important to identify leadership roles that will cease in importance or urgency in the future. So when I said that this is an iterative process, they're still really learning a lot from what they should be doing or from what they're doing right now, but overall it's been a successful endeavor on their end. So let's get to the last few minutes of the conversation. Let's go to the second section, which is all about sourcing broadly. So I'm going to introduce or reintroduce a few data points that you might be familiar with before we talk about the Corning and United Health Group practices. So the information, at least one on the top, should be very familiar. And again, the point here is that, our pipelines are narrow and they're leaky, right? Less than 2% of the typical workforce is typically high potential or successor. Typical reaction or the typical approach that most organizations take is they try to get ahead of the game by identifying high potentials and successors early. So if you take a look at the light blue boxes, specifically the one that I'm pointing to, 61% of organizations we had an opportunity to survey said they began to identify an individual as a potential successor within the first 5 years of their career within the organization. So the sourcing strategy is early identification. And wanted to see if this was the right or not. And what we found is that early identification can, increase your bench strength, right? But really the most important tactic is not the identification, but broad sourcing. So you essentially start with a larger group of people. That larger group of people is not just coming from the business unit where the leadership position is, but you're really looking across the company. And what we found is that if you use your definition of best strengths, which is all about ensuring continuity and optionality, then the most logical strategy that you want to take is a broad sourcing strategy. Because if you do that well, it could potentially increase your bench strength 3 times more than if you use an early identification strategy. If you take a look at the bottom of the page, we've listed some of the benefits of a broad sourcing approach, right? You by nature, you increase your flexibility because, you're basically accessing less traditional sources of successors. So if you just focus on identifying successors from one business unit, you're limited in terms of what successors can do in the future if the role that they've been identified as successors for have changed. But if you're looking across a wider spectrum of talent, they're going to be bringing things to the table, if you will, that might help them assume leadership roles that change or arise in importance in the future. And then take a look at some of the other bullets here. You can also increase retention by a broad sourcing approach, because what you have to do through a broad sourcing approach is really understand what people are interested in, right, in terms of careers, and you can increase retention by placing people where they're really interested in. I'll read the other benefits of broad sourcing or process that on your own time, but did want to share with you that broad sourcing is the most important tactic rather than early identification. Now, to make broad sourcing happen, we have to make something happen before then, in that we need to increase transparency. It is hard for us to tap successors from other parts of the company if we have transparency on who the talent is across the organization. And essentially what these sets of bars are telling you is the more transparency that HR and leaders have regard talent in the organization, the stronger your bench is. So takeaway from this section is you want to make sure you adopt a broad sourcing approach, and what enables broad sourcing is greater transparency of talent across the organization. So, surprise if you take a look at the next page that people struggle with enabling transparency. I'm going to get into the details, but I want to get quickly to the Corning case profile because they have a really interesting approach to ensuring transparency. Just a little bit of background on Corning. It's kind of a other end of the spectrum if you compare it to MTS India. So Corning is a huge organization. They operate in about 70 countries around the world. Each business unit, each division had a very different way of doing succession management, as you can see over on the upper right of the page. So they knew that they had to shift their approach to succession management. They could no longer, have unlinked talent management processes. They had a greater understanding of the talent that's available across the organization, and they had to make sure, where it made sense, that process was standardized across different parts of the world. So this is Corning's solution, or Corning's approach to more successful succession management. You see here toward the middle with the light blue bars or the light blue arrows. First thing that they ensured was process consistency. Because they're such a large organization, they really needed to make sure that where it counts, where it mattered, that they were using the same processes. So one of the things that they wanted to make sure that they had the same process for is how they think about talent, or the information that they get from talent, if you will, so that it's uniform across the board. And that enables them to get greater transparency on all of the talent that exists across the organization. The same information on every talent that's been identified. The other they did, and it's kind of related to what I said earlier, is global talent visibility. That was very important to them. With a company growing as much as they wanted to, but a company as big as theirs, they really wanted to make sure that they had visibility in all of the talent assets that they had. The other thing that they did, again, all of these concepts are related to one another, is they had a database succession plan. Succession plans are informed by, tapping a database or system that Corning created. So time that there was a certain plan that needed to be finalized every time there was a person or position open in a critical part of the company, through the system or through their platform that they developed, they could easily find talent. What I focus on in the conversation about Corning is really that last aspect there, alignment through transparency, because that's really the conversation today. All of the things that Corning has done enables transparency. So it enables the organization to better identify a broader range of successors. One of the things that we really liked about what they did was they created a lot of consistency and enabled transparency regarding talent and the type of conversations they were asking high potentials and successors to have with your managers or with their managers. And you'll see a little bit more information on the next page. So this is one of the things that Corning has done. And basically what they've asked is, if you're a high potential or successor and you're a direct manager of one, you need to have at least one two-way conversation, which they're calling talent planning transparency conversations. No matter where you are, what business, what functional area, or what region you find yourself in, you got to have the conversation and cover all of the elements that you see captured in this circle. Now, some of the conversation components will be owned by the manager, and some will be owned by the employee. All we know is that these conversations have to happen, and they have to be recorded by the manager and inputted into their database or system. Once the conversations are completed, that enables the broad Corning organization to get transparency on, hey, there's somebody from the Philippines, for example, that is really interested in this career path. We have an opening here, and they're mobile. But let me talk a little bit more about what you're looking at here. So these are the components of transparency conversations that need to happen between a high potential or successor and their manager. If you're the high potential or successor, what to prepare for before the conversation is you have to be able to prepare to discuss what your career interests are and what your mobility capability is like. Are you able to move now, in the next 6 months, in the next 12 months? If you're a manager of a high potential or successor, you are required to cover some of the elements in dark blue on this page. To tell the person what talent designation they are, you need to discuss what their development plan looks like. You need to assess their readiness, their capability, their strengths, development areas, their career path, their availability in terms of timing, if you will. So this information is covered in the conversation, and they're also captured in a talent profile template by the manager, which is then uploaded into their central system. So again, by having consistent conversations, you enable transparency. What it allows the manager to do is share the information broadly across the entire organization. And if you're looking for a successor to fill a critical position in the company, you rely on the template that, enabled by a consistent conversation that you see being captured here, you can see the talent that's available to you. So part of the solution is technology, right? But part of it is just consistency in the kinds of conversations that you want people to have and sharing of that information with a broader subset of folks. The other component to this page I just thought was really interesting. They really want to make sure that the employee and the manager come prepared for that talent planning transparency conversation. So the HR organization supports both the manager and the high potential and successor for the conversation. So, as a manager, you have to talk about, 8 elements, or, and as an employee or a high potential or successor, you need to thoughtfully, think about your answers when it comes to the 2 things that you need to be able to have a conversation on. And they just want to make sure that they're setting up these conversations for success by giving them support materials that you see here. So the idea is, let me prepare before the conversation so I know exactly what type of information to share with my manager. And the manager knows exactly what kind of information to ask from the employee. That's the Corning case profile in a nutshell, if you will. I hope that you found it interesting. I'm just going to touch on one last practice, and that's from United Health Group. It actually isn't a new case profile. I think it's been around for a few years, but one of the things that Leah wanted me to focus on are what are some of the things that we can do to enable, the business or enable HR to simply participate in succession planning efforts. And we like some of the things that United Health Group is doing. Let's actually take a look at the bottom of the page. And again, I won't take much of your time anymore, but let me talk about the 3 things that they're doing right now. And it really is kind of focus on development planning, because it's an area where a lot of organizations struggle. One of the areas that organizations struggle is, they don't set high potential expectations, right? So they ask the high potential what their career interests are, but they don't really set expectations on, when potential career interests can be fulfilled by moving people into different positions. The second pitfall that often, befalls many an organization is business leaders and high potentials don't have a enterprise view of careers. They don't have an enterprise view of talent, just kind of like what we talked about with Corning. And then last but not least, organizations just don't follow through. The high potential tells people that these are their career interests, but it never really comes into fruition. So we're just going to highlight a few of the things that United Health Group has done to overcome some of the challenges that you see here. First thing is they give the manager of the high potential a move-ready checklist. So these things that have to be in place for you to be able to assign someone to a different position, to a different role in the company. Again, they're trying to make it as crystal clear as possible. This is also shared with the high potential. So the potential's expectations are set, and they'll be able to move. They don't get disappointed too quickly or have their feelings hurt. And what you don't want to end up is having not a narrow pipeline, but a leaky pipeline as well. So here, very crystal clear. To be a leader, you have to be in the high potential pool. You have to have been in the position that you're in for 2 years, and you have to have at least a meets rating in your last 2 performance review appraisals. So very clear in terms of when you will be able to move as a high potential. The other thing that we liked here is, the kind of very basic support they provide high potential and the direct manager. As a high potential, you need to talk freely and openly about what you want to be able to do from a career perspective. And this is something that your manager or your HR business partner also has to collect information from you on. So very similar to Corning, it's about enabling people to act out their part in succession planning as simply and as effectively as possible. Now, one of the interesting things that United Health Group has done is they basically created a part-time position called a talent broker. It's really someone from the internal recruiting team, and part of their responsibility is to help high potentials move when they're ready to desired or destination positions. The point of making this happen effectively is that it's never anyone's full-time job. No one has complete transparency, if you will. Instead of investing in a technology like Corning, what they actually did is invested in a part-time resource. So you have a talent broker whose responsibility is to understand all of the different open positions in the company, to match those open positions with high potential career interests, bearing in mind that that person has to have met all of the move ready criteria. So one of the ways that you can enable transparency is to designate this responsibility to someone on the HR team. In the case of United Health Group, it was, someone doing internal recruiting, doing this literally at the side of their desk, but part of this responsibility is to ensure that they are, identifying opportunities for high potentials and connecting high potentials to those positions. And that's what you see here on this page. Last but not least, and I promise I'll end my part of the conversation here, part of the other way that you ensure transparency is you connect high potentials or successors to leaders that they normally not have access to. And this is something that is being brokered or offered by the HR organization. So you have informal networking, exploratory discussions as a high potential with different senior executives. And this not only raises your profile with different senior executives, but also gives you as a high potential a good understanding of different opportunities across the organization. So we're again focused on the theme of sourcing broadly, to be able to mitigate against the risk of having a narrow and a leaky pipeline. What we advocate is, source broadly, go beyond the usual suspects, go to different business units, different functional areas, and identify successors. But in order for you to do that successfully, you need transparency. You can either rely on technology like Corning did, or maybe consistency in conversations that happen between high potentials and successors, and record that and sharing it with a broad group of people. Or you could do something like what United Health Group did, a talent broker role that's responsible for matching high potentials to open positions, and then brokering informal networking exchanges between high potentials and senior leaders in the company that they normally wouldn't have access to. So that's a lot of information, but I hope that you found it helpful. And let me know if you have any questions. My contact information is with Leah, as are all the links to the case profiles that we discussed and didn't have an opportunity to discuss. So with that, we'll let everyone go, and thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.